You walk into the antiquities wing of um, any major museum, right?
Hmm.
And there's this a very specific, almost clinical architecture to how we are taught to view the past.
Oh, yeah, it's very boxed in.
Exactly. Like you step into the Egypt room and the placards immediately direct your attention to the sun gods or, the jackal-headed judges of the dead, the elaborate mummies.
Right, the preservation of the body.
Yeah. And then you move down the hall to the Mesopotamia room, and suddenly you're looking at these cuneiform tablets detailing storm gods and epic civilization-destroying floods.
And the historian, who is basically acting as our guide through this curated experience, typically points to these exhibits and asserts that they are completely distinct.
Totally isolated phenomena.
Exactly. The prevailing consensus is just that early disconnected pockets of humanity simply looked up at the terrifying weather or the mystery of death and independently fabricated these rival mythologies.
Just to soothe their collective anxieties, right?
Yeah. It is a deeply compartmentalized way of understanding human history. We treat the development of global mythology as a series of parallel, entirely independent inventions.
Because the underlying assumption is that, since these cultures were separated by vast geography, their stories have to just be rival fabrications.
Right. There's no central reality they're referencing. They're simply different flavors of human imagination trying to explain the unexplainable.
We really like to keep our mysteries neatly boxed by geography. But what happens if we remove the walls between those museum rooms?
That is the exact premise of the text we're exploring today.
Yes, so for this deep dive, we are getting into a fascinating narrative called The Watching Fire, a covenant of shards, a gospel of return. And I want to emphasize, this is a uniquely immersive deep dive for us.
It really is. The source material functions as a chapter-based sacred novel, but the texture of the writing feels entirely different from a standard work of fiction.
It reads like a lost atmospheric chronicle, like something someone has physically carried through the burning ruins of an empire.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to describe it.
And the central demand this text makes of the reader, of you listening right now, is to completely abandon that compartmentalized museum view of history.
It insists that we look at all these global myths, the floods, the sacred mountains, the descending saviors, not as separate localized inventions, but as pieces of a single shattered reality.
So to understand the architecture of this narrative, we have to establish its central operating metaphor immediately.
Right. The text views all global mythologies and ancient traditions through the lens of what it calls shard memory.
Shared memory, I love that term.
It's brilliant. It argues that these traditions, no matter how geographically isolated, are not pure fabrications, they are damaged inheritances.
Like misremembered rumors of a singular original truth.
Exactly. The text treats these mythologies as shattered pieces of a mirror, each catching and reflecting a light that they cannot fully contain or understand on their own.
The idea of a shattered mirror perfectly frames the question I think anyone who studies history eventually asks.
Oh, for sure.
Like, when you look at cultures separated by massive, seemingly uncrossable oceans cultures that had absolutely zero physical contact with one another, why do they all share these oddly specific narrative anchors?
Right, like a great deluge that wipes out humanity.
Or a sacred mountain where the divine interacts with the earthly, a descending savior figure, a serpent associated with hidden knowledge.
And we typically chalk that up to, Jungian archetypes or basic human psychology.
But The Watching Fire approaches this shared narrative DNA as literal fragmented embers. It proposes a history where humanity walked away from a central fire, carrying these embers with them.
And over millennia, the tribes completely forgot the original fire.
Yeah, but they built massive, complex civilizations entirely centered around worshiping the glowing piece of charcoal they actually managed to keep alive.
The text handles this concept with such a delicate balance, though. It doesn't dismiss ancient human myth as mere primitive garbage to be discarded.
Right. It treats these traditions with profound respect.
It acknowledges that they contain genuine, if distorted, truth. But it also treats them as a profound tragedy.
It really forces the reader to confront the brokenness of our global memory. It acknowledges that while the embers are real, kneeling before an ember as if it were the sun is a catastrophic mistake.
It's a fatal error of proportion. But if we're going to understand the nature of the shards, we have to understand the integrity of the mirror before the glass was broken.
Okay, let's unpack this. because the narrative does not begin with the splintering of humanity. It begins way back before the first Ash was ever created.
It establishes a very specific cosmology right out of the gate. The foundational premise of the Watching Fire is a philosophical and theological absolute.
It establishes God as the sole absolute source of reality. And the text uses a very deliberate phrasing here.
Yes, it states that the creator was not the highest peak in a chain of rival summits.
That distinction changes the entire framing of divine power. I mean, when you read ancient texts like the Enuma Elish from Babylon, the creation of the world is the result of a cosmic war.
Right, the gods are fighting each other for supremacy.
Exactly, and the world is built from the carcass of the loser. The divine realm is just a competitive hierarchy. But this text completely rejects that model.
The creator isn't just the strongest being in a universe full of strong beings.
Precisely. In this framework, God is not an object within the universe competing for space or dominance. He is the foundation of reality itself.
The text insists that he is the source from which every height learned what it means to be high. Every flame derived its concept of brightness from him.
Every conscious mind learned the mechanics of thought from his nature. It is an entirely non-competitive view of the divine.
Because he is the source of all existence, there's nothing outside of him that could possibly serve as a true rival.
So, within the immensity of that absolute life, the text describes the creation of the earliest beings, which it calls the morning servants.
These are described as high, swift intelligences, entirely oriented toward glad obedience and guardianship.
But the way their beauty and power are described introduces a concept that I found incredibly arresting. The text calls their splendor true, the way moonlight is true.
Oh, the moonlight analogy. That serves as the philosophical anchor for everything that subsequently unravels in the narrative.
Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, so the text argues that the majesty of these morning servants was entirely borrowed. It was true, undeniably beautiful, but only because it functioned like a perfect mirror.
Think about the physics of a lunar eclipse, right? The moon has no internal mechanism to generate light.
Right, it's essentially a massive inert rock.
Its entire luminosity, the very thing that makes it beautiful in the night sky, is completely dependent on its position relative to the sun.
And the moment the Earth blocks that relationship, the moon just vanishes into darkness.
It doesn't lose its light, it simply loses its connection to the source of the light.
And that is the exact mechanism the text uses to describe holiness. For these celestial beings, their glory was not an internal property they possessed independently.
Their holiness was a function of their proximity to God and their absolute willingness to reflect his nature without distortion.
They received the brightness and returned it, which fundamentally redefines the nature of the fall.
Yeah, when we reach the origin of the adversary, the highest of these morning servants, the text strips away the traditional imagery of a chaotic, sword-swinging rebellion in the clouds.
The fall wasn't a military defeat. It wasn't that the creator had more raw power and simply overpowered a rival.
The text is explicit that the adversary fell because holiness left him, not because his power failed.
His intelligence remained perfectly intact, but it was severed from worship. His brilliance remained, but it was fundamentally bent inward.
The psychological description here is terrifying. It says he grew sick with the desire not to reflect the center, but to occupy it.
It defines the entry of rebellion into the cosmos simply as envy sharpened into will.
It's like a prism deciding that it no longer wants to disperse the light shining through it, but instead wants to claim that it generated the colors itself.
And by refusing to let the light pass through, the prism just becomes an opaque, dark stone.
When a mirror attempts to become a sun, it annihilates its only source of beauty.
This is the text's profound commentary on the ontology of evil. Evil is not presented as a substance. It is not an equal opposing force to the creator.
It's a distortion, a parasite on the good.
Yes, it is the desperate, inherently doomed desire to act as the independent center of a reality that you did not author.
With that cosmic distortion now operating in the background, the text introduces the creation of humanity, made from dusk and breath.
Significantly weaker than the morning servants.
And here I have to challenge the internal logic of the narrative a bit. The text notes that the adversary despised humanity immediately.
Right, because these early humans were physically fragile, shorter-lived, and possessed less intellectual magnitude than the great powers.
Yet, the creator gives them what the text calls a dreadful dignity. Why engineer such a profound vulnerability?
What do you mean?
Well, if you know an immense bent intelligence is actively seeking to corrupt your creation, Why place these fragile humans right in the crosshairs with the capacity to fail so catastrophically?
It is the unavoidable paradox of creating a being capable of genuine relationship. The text defines this dreadful dignity as the capacity for a meaningful answer.
A meaningful answer.
Yes, the creator didn't require decorative instruments or biological algorithms programmed to execute a flawless routine of obedience.
Right, an algorithm can perfectly execute a command,
Yeah.
but it can't love you.
It cannot choose to trust you. For an answer to be meaningful, for love or trust to possess any actual weight, the capacity to refuse must genuinely exist.
It's the difference between raising a child and programming a piece of software.
Exactly. You can guarantee the software will never betray you, but the software will also never comfort you.
The child has the terrifying agency to walk away, to rebel, to cause immense pain. The vulnerability is the necessary collateral of the freedom.
Freedom makes humanity glorious, but it makes them structurally vulnerable. The capacity to kneel implies the mechanical ability to grasp.
The morning servants were operating on a scale of immense power, but humanity was given this intimate, agonizingly real agency in the physical world.
And the adversary, having already chosen to grasp the center rather than reflect it, understood exactly how to weaponize that specific agency.
The methodology of the first temptation reflects that perfectly. It doesn't arrive as an overt threat of violence.
The text says it came merely as a question.
Suspicion made to sound intelligent. It framed crossing the boundary not as a rebellion, but as an awakening.
It's an ancient form of intellectual gaslighting.
And when humanity utilizes their dreadful dignity to choose the suspicion over the trust, the consequences cascade immediately. Shame, then fear.
And finally, the introduction of what the text calls a patient empire. Death.
Calling death a patient empire highlights the inevitability of the fracture. Death doesn't require haste.
Once humanity severed its perfect reliance on the source of life, the biological and spiritual outcome was locked in.
The text is careful to note that the image of God within humanity was not destroyed, but it was deeply, irreparably cracked.
The world itself was transformed into contested ground.
Luminous, but contested.
Oh.
The aesthetic of the world is still beautiful, but it is now inherently tragic.
And this internal fracture in the human condition doesn't remain private for long. It's scaled up as humanity multiplies.
Which leads us to the first massive collective demonstration of this cracked image on the plains of Shinar.
The narrative moves from individual failure to institutional hubris with the building of Babel.
The sociological conditions leading up to Babel are really fascinating. Humanity has discovered the compounding interest of shared speech and cooperation.
They are not just surviving, they are beginning to master their environment.
They learn to bake clay into uniform bricks and use bitumen for mortar. They figure out how to manipulate the earth to build something permanent.
And they decide to consolidate their power by building a massive city and a tower that reaches into the heavens.
The architectural project, however, is merely the physical manifestation of a psychological state.
Right. The text describes the tower not as a building, but as a theology of self-exaltation.
I wanted to dig into that phrase, theology of self-exaltation, because it feels aggressively relevant. It suggests they were trying to replace the divine with their own collective capability.
They were attempting to engineer their way out of the human condition. The builders of Babel operated on the assumption that if human coordination grew vast enough, the inherent mysteries of the universe could be audited.
Heaven could be inspected and quantified.
Destiny, which previously rested in the hands of the Creator, could be actively managed by human bureaucracy.
It is the ultimate technocratic dream. The belief that sufficient data, sufficient coordination, and sufficient technology can fundamentally secure humanity against any higher power or moral consequence.
And the text delivers a blistering critique of this mindset with the line, "Agreement was fatally mistaken for wisdom, coordination mistaken for innocence."
That stopped me cold when I read it. We naturally assume that if millions of people are working in perfect harmony toward a single goal, that goal must be inherently good.
But perfect coordination simply amplifies the underlying nature of the project.
If the foundation is arrogance, then perfect coordination just builds a flawless monument to arrogance.
And that is precisely why the divine intervention at Babel unfolds the way it does. The Creator does not destroy the tower with a thunderbolt.
He simply confuses their languages. The shared speech that enabled their coordination is fractured.
Neighbors who understood the intricate details of brickmaking at dawn find themselves completely bewildered by each other's speech by evening.
Now, I have to push back on how the text frames this divine response. The standard reading of the Babel narrative treats the confusion of languages entirely as a punitive curse.
Right, God punishing humanity for getting too big for their britches.
But the Watching Fire completely subverts that interpretation. It refers to the shattering of human communication as the mercy that looked at first like ruin.
That's such a striking phrase.
How can actively destroying human cooperation and forcing society to collapse into warring, isolated factions be considered a mercy?
To understand it as mercy, you have to understand the alternative, which the text defines as undivided corruption.
Undivided corruption.
Consider the trajectory of the society building the tower. They were entirely unified, but their unity was predicated on an absolute collective narcissism.
They were building a closed system of complete self-deification.
Exactly. If left unchecked, that unified arrogance would have ripened into a single, inescapable catastrophe for the human soul.
Like a global monopoly on pride. If there's only one society and that society becomes entirely corrupt, there is nowhere to flee. There is no outside perspective to challenge the narrative.
When tyrannical power is absolutely centralized and coordinated, it creates a cage from which there is no escape.
So by confusing their speech, God was effectively quarantining the corruption.
He was forcefully decentralizing human power. To the builders, it felt like ruin because their magnificent project collapsed into chaos.
But the underlying reality was mercy. The division prevented them from completing a psychological and spiritual prison that would have permanently severed them from the need for the divine.
And the collapse of Babel serves as the literal mechanism for the central theme of the narrative.
As humanity realizes they can no longer communicate, the coordination breaks down, and they begin to physically scatter away from the plane of Shinar.
But they do not walk away empty-handed. They carry the intellectual and spiritual remnants of their shared history.
They carry the fragments.
They carry the shards.
As these newly formed, language-isolated tribes migrate to the river valleys and the distant coastlines, they carry specific memories.
A memory of an original garden.
A memory of a deceiving serpent. A memory of shining celestial beings, and a catastrophic judgment by water.
But because the community that held the whole story was shattered, the narrative itself shattered.
The text synthesizes this beautifully. It says, "No nation held the whole. They each held an ember and called it the entire fire."
I want to linger on the psychological weight of that. Imagine walking away from a massive bonfire in the dead of winter.
Okay, picture that.
You manage to carry a single glowing ember with you. Eventually, you build a settlement around that one ember.
After a few generations, your descendants have never seen the bonfire. To them, that single ember is the absolute totality of light and heat in the universe.
They build their entire legal, social, and religious structure around tending to that one tiny fragment.
Entirely unaware of the massive inferno it originated from.
And this framework is how the text seamlessly harmonizes all of global mythology.
The reason we see these recurring archetypes, the flood, the mountain, the serpent, across fundamentally isolated cultures, is not mere coincidence.
It's because they all originate from the exact same shattered source material. They are holding genuine pieces of history.
But the tragedy is that they are deeply vulnerable. They possess a fragmented truth, and they are settling into new, untamed lands.
And the text reveals that they were not migrating alone. The Creator established powerful celestial stewards to oversee these scattered nations.
These beings are referred to as the Watchers.
The introduction of the Watchers shifts the narrative from human hubris to cosmic exploitation.
These stewards were originally assigned to guard the fragile, scattered human populations.
However, the psychological vulnerability that brought down the adversary, that desire to be the center rather than a reflection, begins to infect these stewards.
The boundary between stewardship and domination is notoriously thin, even in human politics.
Oh, absolutely.
For these powerful beings, surrounded by vulnerable, awestruck humans holding only fractured memories of the divine, the temptation must have been absolute.
The text says the Watchers began to covet what they were only commanded to guard. They became intoxicated by human admiration.
And more chillingly, human fear became a useful tool to them.
To solidify their dominance and secure this localized worship, the Watchers begin to aggressively accelerate human development.
But they do so by completely bypassing moral maturation.
The text states they taught humans dangerous arts. They gave kings the ideological framework to sanctify appetite.
They instructed priests on how to perfume cruelty with ritual. They introduced advanced metallurgy specifically for the creation of weaponry.
And complex signs for social manipulation.
They gave humanity the tools of gods while humanity still possessed the emotional maturity of terrified animals.
The text distills this era into a single devastating diagnosis. Knowledge was severed from virtue and named progress.
I read that line and immediately thought about the trajectory of the modern world. We have this deep-seated, almost religious belief that technological advancement is synonymous with moral elevation.
It is the defining illusion of the modern era. We assume that because we can split the atom or map the human genome, we are inherently better or more evolved than our ancestors.
But giving a society a more efficient microchip or a faster missile doesn't make that society more just.
Not at all.
If you strip away the moral virtue, you aren't creating a utopia. You are just giving a corrupt human heart a longer lever to inflict damage,
If we can build it, we call it progress.
regardless of whether it makes us more humane or more efficient at being monstrous.
In the age of the Watchers, this technological acceleration, devoid of virtue, institutionalized violence on a terrifying scale.
The Watchers didn't just hand humans swords. They handed them the philosophical justification that the sword is the ultimate arbiter of reality.
The text details how the mighty consumed the field and the flock, and when the abundance inevitably failed, they simply consumed the wheat.
It was an ecosystem of pure domination that devoured ordinary, quiet life.
But in the midst of this suffocating, violent paradigm, the text highlights a single figure who provides a counter-narrative, a man named Enoch.
What I find fascinating is that Enoch doesn't launch a military rebellion against the corrupt kings or the Watchers.
He doesn't try to fight fire with fire.
His form of defiance is profoundly different. The text simply states that Enoch walked with God.
In an era where entire civilizations were addicted to force, manipulation, and the worship of power, choosing to live a quiet life of gentle obedience to the true, unseen creator was an act of supreme, scandalous rebellion.
It's the ultimate contrarian posture. When the entire world is screaming that power is the only truth, choosing humility is the loudest protest possible.
And because of this specific posture, Enoch is granted a unique vantage point. He is drawn upward beyond the immediate physical reality, and he sees the actual architecture of the cosmos.
He sees the Watchers stripped of their terrifying, heroic glamour.
From an earthly perspective, these beings seemed invincible, like the absolute masters of human destiny.
But Enoch sees them standing under the shadow of ultimate justice. He is shown the storehouses of snow and the chambers of wind.
Which is metaphorical language, indicating that the fundamental laws of the universe, the true mechanisms of reality, are held by the Creator.
And these rogue stewards are entirely subject to them. He sees that the power of the Watchers has an expiration date.
They're essentially squatters claiming ownership of a house they didn't build.
But as the text acutely observes, power rarely repents while it still profits. The kings and the Watchers double down, and the world continues to spiral downward into a state that necessitates the flood.
And the description of the pre-flood society is one of the most chilling psychological profiles in the narrative.
It forces the reader to look past the cartoonish idea of cavemen hitting each other with clubs. The violence of the pre-flood world was sophisticated.
The text says, when violence lasts long enough, even horror begins to speak in administrative tones.
Administrative tones. That concept is so vital to unpack. When a society first descends into violence, it's chaotic. It's riots in the streets.
But if that violence is sustained, it eventually becomes institutionalized. It gets a desk.
It gets a paperwork process.
It becomes the banality of evil. The text notes that bloodshed didn't just remain in the streets, it entered the economy.
It became the foundation of ritual, ambition, and law.
When the legal code itself is structured to consume the weak, and the economy relies on systemic brutality, the language of the society adapts to hide the horror.
People don't call it murder anymore. They call it maintaining order or, economic necessity.
The wickedness becomes invisible because it is simply the air everyone breathes.
The response to this deeply entrenched systemic horror is the flood. And the imagery used here is just striking.
The earth, which had been forced to drink the blood of the weak for generations, now drinks the cities of the mighty.
The fountains of the deep rise, and the waters sweep across the plains. And the text describes the waters as being completely indifferent to propaganda.
That is a profound phrase.
The empires had spent centuries building monuments to their own permanence. They had crafted elaborate mythologies about their divine right to rule, their invincibility, their technological superiority.
And the waters of the flood did not negotiate with those claims. Reality simply reasserted itself over the illusion.
But even in the midst of this catastrophic reset, the structural pattern of mercy within judgment holds true. a remnant is preserved.
A small group rides out the violent unmaking of the world in a vessel.
But the text refuses to paint a utopian picture of the aftermath. When the waters finally withdraw and the remnant steps out onto the mud of a ruined world, the text makes a devastatingly clear observation.
The world was cleansed, but it was not cured.
The external manifestations of corruption, the violent empires, the administrative horror, the physical dominance of the rogue stewards, were washed away.
But the internal reality of humanity, that cracked image inherited from the first departure in the garden, remained entirely intact.
The survivors carried the exact same psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities into the new world. History didn't reset to innocence. It simply received a harsh reprieve.
And as this traumatized remnant begins to multiply and spread out once more, we see the immediate consequence of that uncured condition.
They disperse to the major river valleys, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and they carry the original shards from Babel.
But now they have a massive, traumatic new shard to add to the collection.
The memory of the absolute destructive power of the water.
This transition leads directly into the era the text categorizes as the thrones of the shards.
We see the birth of the massive, complex religious systems of antiquity. These societies are desperately trying to make sense of a world that feels incredibly hostile and broken.
And they are doing it using only fragmented pieces of the original truth.
You look at Egypt, isolated by deserts and dependent on the hyper-predictable flooding of the Nile. They construct a theology that attempts to forcefully merge human kingship with cosmic order.
They elevate the pharaoh to the status of a living god, effectively trying to build a biological ladder back into the divine realm.
Attempting to force a connection that was fundamentally severed.
Contrast that with the Canaanite tribes living in the Levant, who are entirely dependent on unpredictable rainfall for survival.
They experienced the world as volatile and dangerous, so they elevated the shards regarding weather and fertility.
They worship the storm as if it were an angry rival lord that had to be continually appeased through increasingly desperate and brutal sacrifices.
Or the seafaring cultures in the Mediterranean, who built mythologies around skyfathers wielding thunder and grim judges residing in the underworld.
The text acts as a lens that pulls all these disparate mythologies into focus, listing the incredibly specific tropes they all share.
A survivor of a great flood, a sacred, inaccessible mountain, a council of gods debating human fate, a judgment of the soul after death.
A dying grain god that represents the cycle of seasons, a returning shepherd king.
The presence of these shared elements proves the origin point. The ancient world was not entirely blind.
The text explicitly says the shards glittered. There is genuine light in these traditions.
A flood actually occurred. There genuinely is a moral judgment after death. There is a reality of shining celestial beings.
But the fatal flaw was that no tribe held the fire entire.
The critical element they lacked was proportion. And this leads to what I consider the most heartbreaking observation in the entire document.
It states, the tragedy of the ancient world was not that it remembered nothing, it was that it remembered in pieces and then knelt before the pieces.
Kneeling before the pieces. That is the purest, most devastating definition of idolatry I have ever encountered.
Idolatry is rarely about worshiping something entirely false. It is almost always about taking a good thing, a true thing, a partial thing, and demanding that it carry the absolute weight of ultimate reality.
It's like taking a single gear out of a watch and bowing down to it, expecting it to tell you the time.
It will only frustrate and eventually crush you. They took the messengers, the remaining echoes of the watchers, and elevated them to the status of creators.
They took the weather and made it a god.
Yet, despite this massive systemic misdirection, the text insists that the creator did not abandon the human mind to total darkness.
Even within the most distorted pagan systems, there remained a stubborn underlying witness to the original truth. The text points to the intrinsic behaviors of humanity as the primary evidence of this.
It points to things like funeral rites. Why do humans across every culture universally engage in complex rituals surrounding the dead?
If we are purely material beings, a dead body is just decaying biomass.
But the text argues that the universal instinct to honor the dead betrays a deep, unshakable longing for judgment rightly measured.
We intuitively know that the physical cessation of life shouldn't be the final meaningless word. We crave a reality where justice is enacted for those who suffered.
The same logic applies to ancient laments. When an ancient person stood in a ruined field or beside a dying child and screamed out a lament to the sky, they were crying out for a depth of mercy and intervention that no stone idol or localized storm god could ever possibly provide.
Their grief was demanding an audience with the absolute.
The text beautifully categorizes this collective underlying ache as the homesickness of the species.
Beneath the smoke of the pagan
Yeah.
shrines, beneath the terrifying blood sacrifices designed to appease volatile nature, there flickered this ancient cellular memory.
A memory that humanity once belonged much nearer to God than it currently knew how to endure.
We were exiles, wandering through the shards, missing a home we couldn't even consciously remember.
This profound homesickness sets the stage for an agonizing period of waiting. Across the centuries, specific prophets begin to rise within a narrow lineage, continually promising that a resolution is coming.
They speak of a ruler, a sufferer, a shepherd who possesses the authority to gather all the scattered pieces of the human story back together.
But while these promises are being whispered, the massive machinery of human empire just keeps churning, trying to fix the world through force.
Assyria rises, thunders across the Middle East with terrifying brutality, and then collapses into dust.
Babylon burns bright, builds its hanging gardens and massive walls, and falls.
Persia, Greece, Rome. The text summarizes millennia of human politics with one brutal sentence. Each empire claimed necessity. None healed the species.
Rome could build incredible aqueducts, enforce a sprawling legal code, and lay down iron roads across a continent, but it could not cure the fracture in the human heart.
The world remained trapped in the dark, waiting for a word from outside the closed system of human power.
And then, into the absolute apex of Roman administrative control and religious institutionalism, the sun enters.
This marks the pivot point of the entire narrative, the subversion of power. And the contrast the text draws here between what humanity expected a savior to look like and how the sun actually arrived is staggering.
It is a masterclass in challenging the corrupted assumptions of the fallen world. Human expectation, having been shaped by millennia of watching empires rise and fall, and having been subtly influenced by the ideology of the Watchers, possessed very specific metrics for how salvation should be accomplished.
Exactly. If you want to change the world, you operate from the top down. Conquerors bring massive armies to impose peace.
High priests bring elaborate, exclusive ceremonies to mediate the divine. Philosophers open elite schools to educate the ignorant.
If the Creator is going to fix the earth, humanity assumes he will arrive as the ultimate emperor, wielding a sword of light, forcing everyone into submission.
But the narrative explicitly subverts that entirely. The sun arrives under the absolute cover of poverty.
He is born in the margins, physically placed where animals feed. The text highlights that his entry was so profoundly quiet, so devoid of the trappings of power, that he was completely missed by everyone who mattered socially, politically, and religiously.
The question we have to ask is why? Why did the divine answer to human suffering have to be so deeply offensive to human expectation?
Because human expectation was fundamentally built on the architecture of rebellion. It was built on the logic of domination, pride, and coerced submission.
If the Creator had arrived with an overwhelming military force, he would have simply been validating the very system that the Watchers used to crush humanity.
He would have been endorsing the theology of Babel. By entering at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, he bypassed the corrupted systems entirely.
His mere existence functioned as a profound disturbance to every closed system he encountered.
In a Roman world obsessed with rank domination and power, he dignified the lowest classes, the poor, the laborers, the outcasts.
In a religious culture that was hyper-fixated on maintaining ritual purity by avoiding the unclean, he actively moved toward contamination.
He touched lepers, dined with traitors, and engaged the marginalized, but without ever being stained by the contact. He didn't become dirty. His presence made the dirt clean.
This expression of humble, invulnerable holiness provoked absolute visceral rage from those who held power.
The text provides a remarkably sharp psychological breakdown of this hatred. It notes that political men feared him because he was entirely incorruptible.
And incorruptibility is the absolute terror of the politician. If a man cannot be bought with wealth, cannot be seduced by status, and cannot be intimidated by the threat of death, he cannot be managed.
And the religious elite hated him for a completely different yet equally revealing reason. They feared him because living holiness exposed what the text calls their institutional theater.
If you have built your entire identity, your wealth, and your societal control on performing precise rituals and aggressively policing the moral borders of your community, the sudden arrival of actual breathing, compassionate holiness is an existential threat.
It reveals to the public that all your robes and rules are just elaborate dress-up.
He threatened the leverage of everyone who held power based on the fractured shards. This inevitable collision course brings about the ultimate test of his methodology.
Before the final confrontation with the human authorities, he faces the wilderness refusal. The adversary, the original architect of the cosmic fracture, approaches the sun.
And the temptation presented here is incredibly sophisticated. It is not an invitation to engage in petty evil.
It's the most insidious proposal possible. The adversary essentially says, "You are the sun. You have the right to rule this entire world, so take it."
Seize the throne right now, but do it by utilizing the world's established methods.
Save humanity by dominating them. Seize the glory, but skip the agonizing sacrifice and the obedience to the Father.
He was inviting the sun to become the ultimate watcher, to establish order through overwhelming coercive force.
And the sun's absolute refusal of this path is described by the text as the hinge of history.
Why does the text place so much weight on that specific refusal? Why is that the hinge?
Because if the sun had accepted that proposal, if he had chosen to redeem the world through coercion and domination, he might have successfully established perfect behavioral order on Earth.
But love would have been left entirely unborn.
You cannot force a meaningful answer with a sword. You cannot compel genuine trust by threatening someone with a thunderbolt.
The sun insisted on preserving human agency, which meant he had to utilize a completely different, terrifying mechanism for redemption.
A mechanism that requires him to absorb the violence rather than inflict it. Which brings us to the climax of the narrative, the event the text refers to as the darkened tree.
Because he adamantly refused to conquer through worldly power, he inevitably collides head-on with the entrenched human corruption of both the political and religious systems.
The crucifixion. And the way the Watching Fire describes this event strips away centuries of neat, sanitized religious iconography.
It forces the reader to look at the raw, mechanical reality of what occurred. The text states that the death of the sun was assembled from very familiar, very ugly human materials.
It lists them meticulously. Betrayal by a friend, the grinding envy of the religious leaders, the political expedience of a governor who knew he was innocent but wanted to avoid a riot.
The spectacle of public theater, private cowardice, and finally, state violence dressed as order.
That last phrase echoes all the way back to the pre-flood world. It was the ultimate horrifying climax of the administrative tones of violence.
It was a moment of terrifying unity. Men who philosophically and politically hated each other, the Roman authorities and the local religious elites, found absolute agreement in one singular objective.
Pure holiness could not be allowed to remain unmastered in their world.
If they couldn't control it, they had to kill it to maintain the illusion of their own sovereignty.
But the narrative immediately shifts from the brutal historical reality of the execution to the massive theological weight occurring beneath the surface.
The cross wasn't just a Roman instrument of torture, it became a cosmic convergence point.
The text argues that the son wasn't merely enduring physical agony. He was actively bearing what it calls the accumulated accusation of the species.
The accumulated accusation.
Mhm.
To grasp the magnitude of that, you have to mentally aggregate the entire history of human failure we have discussed.
Every act of public cruelty that an empire justified as a political necessity. Every private, deeply hidden shame.
Every inherited generational wound that a victim eventually turned outward to inflict on someone else.
Every lie, every rationalization, every grasping act of envy since the first fracture in the garden.
The text claims he absorbed the spiritual weight of all of it.
And he stayed on the tree. The text offers a profound explanation for why. It says, he stayed not because the iron nails were stronger than his divine capability to free himself, but because love desired to go lower than ruin.
Love desiring to go lower than ruin.
I spent a lot of time wrestling with that specific phrase. It forces the question, why was this horrific mechanism necessary? If the Creator is absolute and all-powerful, why couldn't he simply issue a cosmic decree?
Right, why not just wave a hand from heaven and say, the debt is forgiven, you are all pardoned, come back to the fire?
Because doing so would violate the fundamental architecture of truth and justice that the Creator himself established.
If God simply waved a hand and ignored the reality of human guilt, the road home would be barred by truth itself.
You cannot simply pretend that the violence, the betrayals, the administrative horrors of history did not occur. They are real. The blood of the weak cries out for actual justice.
A blanket amnesty without a reckoning isn't mercy, it's a denial of reality. It tells the victim that their suffering didn't matter.
Exactly. Therefore, true mercy could not just float comfortably above the mess of human history. Mercy had to physically descend.
It had to go to the very bottom, beneath the ruin, to the exact place where the judgment was legitimately deserved.
The Son absorbed the just consequence of the fracture, satisfying the demands of truth, in order to construct a legitimate, unbreakable bridge back to the source.
A bridge built on justice, fully satisfied, and love entirely poured out.
Which leads to the silence of the burial. The physical body is placed in a tomb, and for a moment, the world operates under the assumption that the oldest, darkest whisper is true.
That power always wins, and the pure are always devoured in the end.
But the text declares that the grave wasn't merely honored as a memorial site, it was actively invaded by the author of life.
The morning of return. The resurrection shatters the closed system of death.
And the ultimate philosophical takeaway from this event is that tragedy fundamentally lost its claim to ultimacy.
That is the pivotal shift in the mechanics of the cosmos. The text is very careful not to claim that the wounds of human history magically vanished.
The historical trauma of Babel, the flood, the empires, it didn't unhappen.
But in the resurrected body of the Son, who still bore the scars of the crucifixion, the text says the wounds became suffering transfigured.
Because he carried the ultimate suffering through the boundary of death and out the other side into life, suffering no longer possesses the final, definitive word over the human condition. It can be transformed.
And the implications for the powers of the world are massive.
For all those lesser thrones, for the watchers who demanded worship, for the corrupt empires built on the economics of despair, and for the adversary who assumed he had won by orchestrating the crucifixion, they receive their final sentence in advance.
Their borrowed, distorted authority is put on notice. The hinge of history has officially turned.
The cosmic mirror that shattered, the human image that cracked, a legitimate pathway has been forged to begin putting the pieces back together.
Which brings us to the final, immensely practical movement of the narrative. The cosmic victory has been won, but humanity is still living in the messy aftermath.
How does a normal person actually process this? How do we make sense of all these scattered, glittering shards now that the central fire has conquered death and initiated the return?
To answer that, the narrative jumps forward generations later, introducing us to a deeply relatable character, a scribe named Eliashar ben Neriah.
He is essentially an ancient archivist, an intellectual trying to synthesize the chaos of human history.
He sits surrounded by scrolls. He studies the Hebrew laws and prophets. He reads the flood accounts from the Babylonian tablets. He analyzes the philosophical fragments from Greece and the funerary texts from Egypt.
He listens to isolated desert sects talk about the fallen watchers and the unseen war behind the veil of reality.
He is a man profoundly buried in the shards of human memory.
And as he studies, he reaches a breaking point. He realizes that the convergences across all these disparate cultures are simply too persistent to dismiss as coincidence.
They are all pointing, however clumsily, toward the exact same lost realities.
In the midst of this overwhelming study, he receives a distinct inward command. Gather the shards. Compelled by this, he embarks on a journey that provides the most vivid, immersive imagery in the entire text.
I want you to paint this picture clearly for the listener.
Imagine stepping into that valley. Eliashar travels far to the north, into rugged cedar country, searching for a hidden valley that older, mystical monks speak of with a deep, uneasy reverence, a place they call the Forest of Tongues.
It is the ultimate metaphorical landscape of the human search for meaning.
As the wind blows through the dense branches of the ancient cedars, it doesn't sound like rustling leaves. It sounds like the whispering of forgotten alphabets.
The water running over the stones in the creek sounds like the murmur of worn, ancient liturgies, prayers repeated desperately for thousands of years by people aching for home.
And there, standing in the very center of the trees, is a massive pillar. The text describes it as pale as moonlit bone.
And the surface of the pillar is alive.
It is covered in constantly moving signs, the wedge-shaped marks of Sumerian cuneiform, the flowing curves of Egyptian hieratic, the sharp strokes of Hebrew, the geometric lines of early Greek.
It is a physical manifestation of every alphabet humanity ever utilized to try and articulate their profound homesickness.
It stands as the ultimate monument to the fractured human attempt to grasp the divine after Babel.
Eliashar approaches this overwhelming monument and he lays his hand flat against the pale stone.
And here, the text makes a remarkably careful, highly nuanced distinction about what actually happens to his mind in that moment of contact.
It is a vital distinction for understanding the entire thesis of the text. When Eliashar touches the pillar in the Forest of Tongues, he does not magically receive a brand new, freshly invented religion.
He doesn't get a secret, esoteric download of hidden knowledge that makes him smarter than everyone else.
No, what the contact grants him is a profound sense of proportion.
Proportion. That is the exact antidote to the tragedy we discussed earlier regarding the ancient mythologies.
Exactly. Remember, the core failure of the ancient tribes. They possessed genuine, truthful fragments of the original story, but they utterly lacked proportion.
They took a legitimate shard, like the memory of the flood or the reality of the storm, and they inflated it, calling it the entire mirror.
They made the secondary things ultimate. When Eliashar is granted proportion, his mind is finally equipped to see how all the chaotic, scattered pieces of global history actually fit together around the central truth of the sun.
Without ever needing to elevate a broken piece to the status of ultimate reality. He finally understands the true landscape.
He sees that the scattered nations did genuinely carry embers from the original fire. They weren't just hallucinating their myths.
He recognizes that rogue celestial powers did actively accept and manipulate human worship that did not rightfully belong to them.
He sees the profound tragedy of the shards. He sees the flakes of pure gold hopelessly mixed in with the heavy, corrupt ore of human pride and demonic influence.
And because he possesses proportion, he understands the mandate. The truth must be gathered from across the human experience, but, and this is the critical safeguard, it must be gathered without granting equal authority to every broken mirror.
It's the rejection of lazy syncretism. You don't just look at the scattered puzzle pieces, realize they are all made of cardboard, and try to violently mush them all together into a blurry pile.
Declaring, well, every religion has a piece of the truth, so they are all equally valid paths.
Because mushing them together in a false equivalence entirely ignores the very real, devastating damage that human pride, administrative violence, and the influence of the Watchers inflicted on those traditions over millennia.
Possessing proportion means having the discernment to recognize and honor the underlying original truth, while simultaneously and actively rejecting the historical distortion attached to it.
Armed with this transformative clarity, Eliashar leaves the Forest of Tongues and sits down to write what the narrative titles, A Gospel of Return.
And the message he crafts is radically countercultural, not just for the ancient empires of his day, but for the philosophical trends of our own era.
He doesn't just critique the overt paganism of the Roman world. He takes direct aim at a completely different, deeply insidious threat that always emerges in highly developed societies.
He directs his critique at the spiritual aristocrats.
The elites. He writes fiercely against the pride of hidden groups who claim that the path to salvation requires mastering secret passwords, navigating complex layers of specialized philosophical knowledge, or achieving some hidden mystical rank.
He targets that recurring human tendency, which we see in ancient Gnosticism and modern esoteric movements, to declare that the physical, material world is inherently evil or illusory.
And that the ultimate goal is to computationally or spiritually escape the biological body. He completely, unequivocally rejects that framework.
He summarizes his rejection with a beautiful, grounding principle. The true fire is not given to flatter the few. Creation is wounded, not worthless.
Creation is wounded, not worthless. That single sentence is a breathtaking statement of hope.
The material world, the dirt under our feet, our biological bodies, the physical reality of the earth, none of it is disposable garbage meant to be discarded by an enlightening mind.
It is a masterpiece that suffered profound damage. Therefore, true redemption is never about finding an escape hatch out of reality.
It is about a disciplined, agonizing, yet joyful return to our originally intended home.
The path back to the fire does not run through vanity disguised as elite, specialized knowledge. It runs directly through acknowledging the truth of our fracture, practicing genuine repentance, extending the mercy we received, and maintaining a living connection to the King who broke the closed system of death from the inside out.
This narrative covers an unimaginably vast territory. We started our exploration today before the concept of time, observing the morning servants shining with a borrowed splendor, perfectly reflecting a glory they did not generate.
We watched the terrifying internal collapse of the adversary, whose envy demanded ownership of the light.
We examined the dreadful dignity of human freedom and how the weaponization of that freedom fractured the world, introducing the patient empire of death.
We stood on the baked clay of the plain of Babel, dissecting the theology of self-exaltation, and witnessed how a merciful ruin shattered the monolith of human pride, scattering a confused humanity armed only with their ember-like memories.
We analyzed the dark age of the Watchers, who transitioned from guardians to dominators, ushering in an era where technological progress was entirely severed from moral virtue, and violence became so normalized it spoke in the administrative tones of bureaucracy.
We saw the inevitable, terrifying reset of the flood and watched the traumatized survivors build the sprawling global mythologies, tragically kneeling before the broken pieces of truth, driven by an unshakable homesickness for the divine.
We waited through the rise and fall of empires until the sun arrived, quietly, but absolutely subverting every closed system of human power.
We witnessed his refusal of the temptation to dominate and stood before the darkened tree where he absorbed the accumulated accusation of our species, ultimately transfiguring the nature of suffering through his resurrection.
And finally, we followed Elia Sharar into the whispering cedars of the Forest of Tongues, realizing that our intellectual and spiritual mission is not to invent a novel truth, nor to escape into a secret spiritual aristocracy.
But to humbly gather the shards with proper proportion, continually pointing every fragment of truth back toward the original fire.
Translating the immense scope of the watching fire to the immediate reality of you listening right now, the parallels are impossible to ignore.
We currently inhabit a world that is suffocating under an avalanche of fragmented information. We are drowning in competing ideologies, loud, polarized truths, and a deeply felt, almost suffocating universal alienation.
The anxiety, the constant frantic search for meaning and identity, these are all acute symptoms of that original historical fracture.
We are a deeply advanced society, but we are still fundamentally driven by that ancient homesickness.
We are. And the profound stabilizing lesson of this narrative is that navigating our modern existence is not about seeking an escape from reality.
It is not about acquiring some elite, hyper-specialized knowledge that elevates you above the ignorant masses.
It is entirely about the difficult work of seeking proportion. It is about possessing the humility to recognize the deep brokenness within ourselves and within our complex societal systems.
Having the grace to acknowledge the valid shards of truth wherever they are genuinely found, and consciously, daily, leaning our weight toward the true, non-competitive source of the light.
As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over in the context of your own daily life. Think about the architecture of the modern internet.
Think about our sprawling, hyper-connected digital landscape.
In so many terrifying ways, it functions as our own global plane of Shinar. It is a brilliant, glowing digital Tower of Babel, where we increasingly operate under the illusion that our vast, coordinated agreement, our highly curated echo chambers, are the exact same thing as wisdom.
We subconsciously believe that because we are perfectly connected, we are gods, capable of auditing mystery and managing human destiny through data.
We are currently building a theology of digital self-exaltation.
Exactly. So here's the question you have to ask yourself.
If a modern-day scribe, a new Eliashar, were to walk into the forest of tongues of our current digital age, into the endless chaotic scroll of information, targeted arguments, and behavior-modifying algorithms, what lesser powers are we unknowingly kneeling before today?
Why unseen watchers are quietly managing our appetites, fueling our outrage, and labeling the decay of our virtue as progress.
And amidst all that deafening noise, what true ancient embers of the original fire are still hidden beneath the scroll, quietly waiting to guide us back home?